The 15th annual Boston Latino Film Festival gets underway on Thursday with showings at locations in Boston and Cambridge. To tell us about the lineup is the festival's director, Sabrina Avilés. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, talk about the whole lineup here. I mean, you've got, which countries are we talking about with these films?
Oh, we're talking about always Mexico. We're talking about the Caribbean. We have one film from the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Venezuela, Argentina, Chile, and also, of course, a lot of U.S.-based filmmakers as well.
And of course, as far as the topics, I mean, one of these films, I guess it's very topical because it's about a big problem in Mexico, the violence against women.
Exactly, and actually it's violence against a lot of people because it's called Tempestad, the Tempest. And the reason I also want to mention it is because it's now being, Mexico has selected it to submit it in the Oscar race for Best Foreign Language Film. But it's a powerful documentary told mostly in voiceover about a survivor of a kidnapping, which happens a lot in a lot of states in Mexico. And so it's one thing where it's basically something that happens between the government and the cartels, even though both parties tend to deny their involvement. So
some of the topics and countries, they're a little surprising. I mean, skateboarders in Cuba?
Yes, skateboarders in Cuba, exactly. It's actually a wonderful film. A lot of Cuban films also. It's a wonderful film about skateboarding in Cuba and how it's just starting, but it also has underlying themes of just like the economic situation in Cuba, the relationship now between, the precarious relationship between Cuba and the United States. So it has a lot of other themes than just skateboarding.
And don't forget Brazil, you got Brasil, meu amor.
Brasil, meu amor, or whatever, however they say it. Again, it's about a love story, about a couple breaking up, but again, a lot of our films are layered, so what is apparent to the eye is not always there because it talks about larger issues, about politics, about the diaspora, about surviving as a Brazilian here in the United States. So.
No, I have to admit, with so many films, are they all anguishing? Or, I mean, is there comedy in here somewhere?
No, there is definitely some, actually there's a wonderful film that precedes the Brazilian film. It's just a Brazilian short about, it's a comedy, but it's about a steakhouse and like the hierarchy in a steakhouse, how there's people who serve the meat and there's people who serve bread. But again, multi-layered theme. And then there's wonderful family films. So one film that I would recommend is a film called, another Cuban film, Esteban, purely for family, about a young boy who really wants to learn how to play piano, and he sneaks his way into piano lessons, and so you kind of grow fond of him and then the ornery teacher who teaches him lessons. So.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Sabrina Avilés from the Boston Latino Film Festival. Among the documentaries, there's one about a very interesting historical story about an activist and theater director in Chile, Victor Jara.
He was actually an activist singer, yes, and actually that's a film like 7 other films that has local ties. The writer and producer is from Vermont, and they did this wonderful film, archival, based on sort of his story and the people who influenced him, who he influenced, and eventually he was assassinated by the Allende regime in Chile.
Now, and of course, there are efforts by his family to preserve his work, I think, and do things like that.
Exactly. So there's efforts to that, and this is sort of a homage to that effect for the film itself. So.
What about cross-cultural influences? Because we have people who start out, in Latin America, like Iñárritu, and then he ends up doing an Academy Award competitor here in this country. I mean, is there a lot of cross-cultural things going on?
It's funny because our opening night film is Chavela, and Chavela is a very pretty much everybody in Latin America knows who Chavela Vargas is. She's this wonderful singer who used to sing rancheras that are typically sung by Mexican rancheras that are typically sung by males, and she came on the scene in the 40s and 50s in Mexico. And the reason I say it's cross-cultural is because this is a story that could have been told by a Spanish filmmaker or by a Mexican filmmaker, but instead it was told by 2 American-born filmmakers. And I don't know honestly how they found out about her story, but to me it's wonderful that these American-born filmmakers, female by the way, they are telling this story that's very typical and about really a celebrity that's well known all over Latin America and in Spain. So,
I imagine festival. You always think, well, film buffs. They want to see these kinds of films, but there are many people here of Latin American heritage. What's it like? I mean, compared to what they can get elsewhere, how important is a festival like this?
Well, I think the thing is that we're used to. It's very interesting. That's a good question because in Latin America, Latino filmmakers here tend to have a very sort of a Hollywood approach or sensitivity to the way they make films, which is not bad at all. But I think in the films that we present from the countries themselves tend to be a little bit more art housey, if you will, so they have a very specific point of view, and many are sort of quiet films. But then we have other films that are a little bit more commercial, but again, sort of, they're directed in a sort of not a very typical American lens. So I think that's what makes it interesting. It's sort of the 4 days of the festival, you get a little bit of a potpourri of all different types of points of view that are very different to what we're used to seeing, coming out of Hollywood, and even to a certain extent in the whole independent film world here. Slightly different, with things like magical realism, which is very, very much a part of our culture,
What would you point to among these films where you could look for some elements of magic realism?
Again, magical realism is in our closing night film, I Dream in Another Language, Soñé en otro idioma. It was a Sundance favorite. And again, it's a story that you first see and you're like, oh, this kind of moves slow. But then as you see it, it has, again, very layered because it talks about these two indigenous men who actually had a love affair in their early years. And then there are elements of magical realism sprinkled throughout that I think that is done masterfully. And there is a short prior to that, Swimming in the Desert, where, again, made by an American filmmaker, but again, you could see the influences of the whole magical realism take in his film.
We should finally mention this is starting on Thursday, and if people want to get tickets and find more details about what is showing where, what's the best way to?
Best way is to come to our website, bliff.org, and then we'll have links to buy either tickets through Eventbrite or Arts Emerson.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Sabrina Avilés from the Boston Latino Film Festival. Up ahead, more highlights from high school football with Pat Flaherty.